July in Harlem is not just a month, it is a physical weight. In 1968, the humidity hung over the streets like a wet wool blanket, trapping the heat, the noise, and the tension of a city on the brink of explosion. The air smelled of asphalt that had melted during the day and never quite hardened back up, mixed with the exhaust of Cadillacs and the faint, sweet scent of peach cobbler drifting from the open windows of the tenements. It was a summer of fire and unrest, a summer where the entire country felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. For Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the weight was heavier than for anyone else. He was 62 years old, but his eyes held the fatigue of a man who had lived 1,000 lifetimes. He sat in the back of his black Lincoln Continental, watching the familiar streets of his kingdom roll by through the tinted glass. He controlled the numbers, the protection, and the flow of everything that moved in Harlem, but he could not control the thumping in his own chest. It had started a few weeks ago, a dull, rhythmic ache in his sternum, like a fist gently squeezing his heart. He hadn't told anyone, not his wife Mamie, who would have dragged him to a hospital and locked him in a room until he was well, and certainly not his lieutenants, who would have seen it as blood in the water. In his world, a king could be hated, he could be feared, but he could never, ever be sick. Sickness was a weakness, and weakness was a death sentence. Sitting next to him in the plush leather seat was the future, or at least the man who desperately wanted to be the future. Frank Lucas was everything Bumpy was not. Where Bumpy was silence, Frank was a shout. Where Bumpy was a shadow, Frank was a spotlight. Frank was wearing a chinchilla coat in July. "You're sweating, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble that barely rose above the hum of the Lincoln's powerful air conditioning. Frank Lucas flashed a grin that seemed to have more teeth than a shark. He adjusted the collar of the thick gray fur, running his hand over the pelts as if they were holy relics. "It's not sweat, Bumpy. It's a glow," Frank said, laughing at his own joke. "Besides, when you look this good, the temperature don't matter. People expect a show. You gotta give 'em a show. That's what being a boss is. It's theater." Bumpy looked at him, his expression unreadable. He had taken Frank under his wing, taught him the chessboard of the streets, showed him how to move in silence. But Frank had a hunger in him that Bumpy found unsettling. It wasn't just a hunger for money, it was a hunger for fame. Frank didn't just want to run the game, he wanted his name in lights while he did it. "A boss is a target," Bumpy corrected him softly. "The brighter you shine, the easier you are to hit. You wear a coat like that, you might as well paint a bullseye on your back." Frank waved a hand, dismissing the wisdom with the arrogance of youth. "Nobody's going to touch me, not when I'm standing next to you. We're untouchable, Bumpy. The king and the prince. That's what they call us." Bumpy turned back to the window. The pain in his chest flared again, sharper this time, a jagged spike of electricity that made his left arm tingle. He gritted his teeth, forcing his face to remain impassive. He knew with the cold certainty of a man who had dealt in death his whole life that his time was running out. He had made his peace with it, but he hadn't made his peace with what he was leaving behind. He looked at Frank, preening in the reflection of the window, and wondered if he had created a monster or a successor. "Driver," Bumpy said, "take us to Wells." Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue was the heartbeat of Harlem's nightlife. It was famous for its chicken and waffles, but more importantly, it was famous for its clientele. At 2 a.m, Wells was where the worlds collided. You could find jazz musicians sitting next to judges, politicians eating grits across from hitmen, and civilians pretending not to notice any of it. It was neutral ground, a sanctuary of grease and gossip. As the Lincoln pulled up to the curb, the sidewalk was already crowded. Men in sharp suits leaned against lampposts, smoking cigarettes. Women in evening gowns laughed, their jewelry catching the streetlights. When the big black car stopped, the conversation on the sidewalk died instantly. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. This was the power Bumpy Johnson commanded. He didn't need a chinchilla coat. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone was enough to silence a city block. The driver hurried around to open the door. Bumpy stepped out first. He moved slowly, deliberately, using his cane not because he needed it, but because it added to the myth. He wore a simple, tailored charcoal suit. No flash, no diamonds, just immaculate, terrifying dignity. Then Frank stepped out. If Bumpy was the silence, Frank was the cymbal crash. He stepped onto the pavement with a flourish, throwing his arms out as if expecting applause. The diamonds on his fingers, rings on almost every digit, glinted in the neon light of the restaurant sign. The chinchilla coat looked ridiculous in the humid night air, a symbol of excess that bordered on the comical, but nobody laughed. You didn't laugh at Frank Lucas. "There he is!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "The man!" Frank soaked it up. He pointed a finger gun at the voice, winking. "Good to see you. Drinks are on me tonight." Bumpy sighed, a sound lost in the noise of the street. He walked toward the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for threats, looking for the telltale bulge of a weapon or the nervous eyes of a betrayal. He saw nothing but admiration and fear. They entered the restaurant. The smell hit them immediately. Fried chicken, sweet syrup, coffee, and tobacco smoke. It was a comforting smell, the smell of home. The chatter inside was loud, a wall of sound that vibrated against the wood-paneled walls. But as Bumpy walked past the bar, the noise dipped, rolling away in front of him like a wave. The owner, a nervous man with a towel over his shoulder, rushed out from behind the counter. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Lucas, we have your booth ready, the best one in the house." He led them to a red leather booth in the back corner. It was Bumpy's spot. It offered a clear view of the front door, the kitchen entrance, and the bathroom hallway. A strategist's seat. Bumpy slid in, sitting with his back to the wall. He exhaled slowly, the leather creaking under his weight. The pain in his chest was a constant thrum now, a drum beat that matched the rhythm of the jazz playing on the jukebox. Frank slid in opposite him, still wearing the coat. He looked around the room, making eye contact with everyone, nodding, smiling. He was working the room without leaving his seat. "Take the coat off, Frank," Bumpy said. "You look like a bear in a sauna." Frank laughed but shrugged the heavy fur off his shoulders, letting it pile up on the seat next to him like a dead animal. "Just giving the people what they want, Bumpy. They don't want a businessman. They want a star." "They want a leader," Bumpy said, picking up the menu even though he knew it by heart. "And a leader knows when to stop acting." A waitress appeared, a pot of coffee in her hand. She was an older woman who had worked at Wells for 20 years. She wasn't afraid of Bumpy. She had served him coffee when he was young and hungry, and she served him now that he was old and legendary. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," she said, pouring the dark liquid into his cup. "You look tired tonight. Can I get you the usual?" "Just the coffee for now, Betty," Bumpy said, offering her a rare, genuine smile. "And maybe some of those grits. My stomach is feeling a little unsettled." And for the movie star? Betty asked, looking at Frank with a mixture of amusement and judgment. Chicken legs, Betty, Frank boomed. And biscuits, lots of butter. And bring a bottle of champagne, the good stuff. We don't sell champagne, Frank, Betty said dryly. This is a diner. Then send a runner to the liquor store. Frank peeled a $100 bill from a roll in his pocket and slapped it on the table. Keep the change. Betty shook her head, took the money, and walked away. Bumpy watched the exchange with sad eyes. You throw money around like it screams, Bumpy said. Money should whisper, Frank. When it screams, people start listening, and when they listen, they start planning on how to take it. Let them plan, Frank said, leaning forward, his eyes bright with adrenaline and ego. I got you. I got the crew. Who's going to touch us? The Italians? The police? We run this city. Bumpy took a sip of the hot coffee. It scalded his tongue, but the heat felt good. It distracted him from the cold feeling spreading in his left arm. I run this city, Bumpy corrected him softly. You just live in it. And soon you're going to have to learn that the crown is heavy. It breaks your neck if you don't hold your head right. Frank frowned, sensing the shift in Bumpy's tone. Why you talking like that? You feeling okay? Bumpy waved a hand. Just tired. It's been a long summer. The food arrived. Bumpy picked at his grits. He wasn't hungry. Nausea was rolling in his stomach like a tide. He wanted to go home. He wanted to be with Mamie. He wanted to sit in his favorite chair and listen to the silence. But he couldn't leave yet. Leaving now would look like weakness. He had to finish his coffee. He had to show the room that the king was still on his throne. Frank was tearing into a chicken leg, talking with his mouth full, recounting a story about a deal he had made in Jersey. He was animated, loud, happy. He was alive in a way Bumpy hadn't been for years. Then he appeared. A young man, skinny, wearing a fedora that was too big for him and carrying a large camera with a massive flashbulb attachment. His name was Smokey. He was a freelance photographer who sold pictures to the local papers and sometimes to the tabloids downtown. He was a hustler, scrounging for scraps, trying to catch a celebrity or a politician in a compromising position. Smokey had been hovering near the door for 20 minutes, working up the courage. He saw the chinchilla coat. He saw the diamonds. He saw the legend. He walked up to the booth, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Lucas, we have your booth ready. The best one in the house. Smokey stammered. I'm a huge fan. Huge fan. I take pictures for the Harlem Gazette. I was wondering, could I get a snap? Just one? For the history books? Bumpy didn't look up from his coffee. He hated pictures. Pictures were evidence. Pictures were vanity. Pictures were for people who needed to prove they existed. No pictures, Bumpy rumbled. I'm eating. Smokey's face fell. He took a step back, ready to retreat. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. I didn't mean to intrude. But Frank Lucas wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. Hold on, Frank said, flashing that shark smile again. Don't run off, kid. The man is eating, but I ain't. Frank stepped out of the booth. He smoothed his suit jacket. He fixed his tie. He looked at Bumpy. Come on, Bumpy. Let the kid take a shot. It's for the history books, right? Bumpy looked up at Frank. He saw the desperation in Frank's eyes. Not desperation for safety, but desperation for validation. Frank needed the camera to love him. "Sit down, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice straining. The pain in his chest was becoming a crushing weight, like an anvil sitting on his ribs. "Don't be a fool." "One picture," Frank said, ignoring him. Frank didn't stand in front of the table. That would block Bumpy. Instead, he stepped to the side, leaning one hand on the wooden partition of the booth, striking a pose that filled the left side of the frame while leaving Bumpy perfectly visible in the right. Frank hooked his thumbs into his vest. He tilted his chin up. He grinned, a wide, beaming, million-watt smile that said, "I am the king of the world." "Make it a good one, kid," Frank said to Smokey. "Make sure you get the diamonds." Smokey raised the camera. He framed the shot. In the foreground, Frank Lucas was glowing with charisma and arrogance. In the background, sitting in the shadows of the red leather booth, Bumpy Johnson dropped his fork. It didn't clatter loudly. It just slipped from his numb fingers onto the napkin. A soft thud that was lost under the noise of the restaurant. Frank didn't hear it. He held his smile. But Bumpy was dying. The pain exploded in Bumpy's chest. It wasn't an ache anymore. It was a demolition. It felt like his heart was tearing itself apart. The air left his lungs in a rush. His vision blurred, the edges of the room turning black. He tried to say Frank's name. He tried to call out to the boy he had raised, the boy he was trying to save. "Far." No sound came out. Just a gasp. Bumpy's hand flew to his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt. His fingers curled into a claw. His eyes went wide, not with fear, but with sudden, terrible realization. This was it. The checkmate. He slumped forward. His head lolled back against the red leather. He looked directly at the back of Frank's head. He looked at the man who was too busy posing for a picture to notice that his father was leaving the world. Smokey, looking through the viewfinder, saw it. He saw Frank smiling. He saw Bumpy clutching his chest. He hesitated. His finger hovered over the shutter button. He knew he should stop. He knew he should yell. But he was a photographer, and a photographer's instinct is to capture the moment, no matter how horrific. Click. P.O.P. The flashbulb exploded with a blinding white light. It was like lightning striking inside the restaurant. It illuminated everything for a fraction of a second. The grease on the tables, the smoke in the air, the diamonds on Frank's fingers, and the death on Bumpy's face. The light faded instantly, leaving purple spots dancing in everyone's eyes. "That was a beauty," Frank laughed, clapping his hands. "That's the cover of the magazine right there. Did you get the rings?" Frank turned around. He was beaming. He was high on the adrenaline of being seen. "Hey, Bumpy, you should have jumped in, you old grump. We could have..." The words died in his throat. Frank stared at the booth. Bumpy was slumped sideways. His eyes were half open, staring at nothing. His hand was still clutching his chest. A line of spittle ran down his chin. The cup of coffee had tipped over, spilling dark liquid across the white tablecloth, dripping onto the floor like black blood. The silence that followed was louder than the flashbulb. "Bumpy?" Frank whispered. He took a step forward. His legs felt like water. The arrogance, the flash, the ego, it all evaporated in a millisecond, leaving behind a terrified boy. "Bumpy?" Frank said louder. He reached out and grabbed Bumpy's shoulder. "Hey, stop playing! Bumpy!" He shook him. Bumpy's head rolled loosely. He was heavy. Dead weight. "Call an ambulance," Frank screamed. The sound tore through the restaurant, shattering the jazz music. "Somebody call a doctor. Help me. Help him!" Frank dragged Bumpy out of the booth. He laid him on the dirty tile floor of the restaurant. He didn't care about his suit. He didn't care about the chinchilla coat lying on the seat. He ripped Bumpy's shirt open, buttons popping and rolling away. "Breathe!" Frank yelled, pounding on Bumpy's chest. "Breathe, you stubborn old man! Don't you do this to me. Not now. Not like this." The restaurant erupted into chaos. People were screaming. Betty the waitress dropped a tray of dishes. The owner was on the phone, yelling for help. Smokey, the photographer, stood frozen. He held the camera against his chest. He knew what he had just captured. He felt sick. He felt like he had stolen a soul. He looked at Frank Lucas, who was on his knees, weeping, begging Bumpy Johnson to come back. It was a scene of pure heartbreak. Frank loved the man. Anyone with eyes could see that now. But the camera hadn't seen now. The camera had seen then. The camera had seen the second before. The camera had seen Frank smiling while Bumpy died. Smokey looked at the exit. He looked at the angry, grieving men surrounding Frank. If they knew what was on his film, they would kill him. They would smash the camera and beat him to death for the disrespect. Smokey made a choice. He turned and ran. He slipped through the crowd, out the front door, and into the humid Harlem night. He clutched the camera like it was a bomb. Back inside, Frank collapsed over Bumpy's body. He stopped CPR. He knew it was useless. He felt the stillness. The king was gone. Frank laid his head on Bumpy's chest, sobbing, his expensive suit soaking up the spilled coffee and the floor grease. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered into the silence of the dead man's shirt. "I'm sorry, Bumpy. I wasn't looking. I should have been looking." The paramedics arrived 10 minutes later, but there was nothing to do. They covered Bumpy's face with a sheet. Frank stood up. He looked destroyed. His eyes were red, his face swollen. He looked around the room, daring anyone to speak. "Nobody says a word," Frank growled, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "Nobody says nothing about this. He just went to sleep. You hear me? The king just went to sleep." The crowd nodded. They were terrified. They had just watched the end of an era. But outside, in the dark room of a small apartment on 145th Street, Smokey was developing the film. He watched the image appear in the chemical bath. First the shadows, then the faces. He saw it. The contrast was sharper than reality. Frank Lucas, looking like a millionaire, grinning with all the vanity of the devil. And behind him, over his shoulder, Bumpy Johnson, looking like a martyr, clutching his heart in the final moment of agony. It looked like Frank was laughing at him. It looked like Frank was happy he was dying. It looked like betrayal. Smokey stared at the photo. He knew he held a weapon in his hands, a weapon that could destroy Frank Lucas before he even sat on the throne. He heard a knock on his door. He froze. "Smokey," a voice called out. It wasn't Frank. It was a rough voice, a voice he recognized from the pool halls. It was a runner for one of the rival crews, a man who worked for a gangster named Red Top, a man who had wanted Bumpy's spot for years. "I know you were at Wells," the voice said through the door. "I saw you run out. Did you get the shot?" Smokey looked at the photo. He looked at the door. He was broke. He was scared. "Yeah," Smokey whispered. "I got the shot." "Open up," the voice said. "Red Top wants to see it. He'll pay good money for a picture of the king's last moment." Smokey opened the door. By sunrise, Bumpy Johnson's body was in the morgue. Mamie was weeping in Queens. Frank Lucas was sitting in the dark at the bottom of a bottle of whiskey, hating himself for looking away. But on the streets of Harlem, a new story was already being printed. Red Top had access to a print shop in the basement of a laundromat on Lenox, and the offset press was running hot. They weren't talking about how Frank tried to save him. They weren't talking about the grief. They were talking about the smile. The lie was halfway around the world while the truth was still putting on its shoes. And Frank Lucas, the man who wanted to be king, was about to find out that a picture is worth 1,000 knives in the back. The war for Harlem hadn't ended with Bumpy's last breath. It had just begun, and the first shot wasn't fired from a gun. It was fired from a camera. The morning after Bumpy Johnson died, Harlem didn't rise. It mourned. The sun came up, but the shutters stayed closed. The music on the radios played low and slow, gospel and blues, the soundtrack of loss. The street corners, usually buzzing with the rhythm of the hustle, were somber. Men took off their hats when they passed the 22 West restaurant. Women wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs. The protector was gone. The roof had been ripped off the house, and everyone felt exposed to the storm. Frank Lucas hadn't slept. He sat in the penthouse of his apartment building, staring out at the city that looked different today than it had yesterday. Yesterday, it was a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Today, it looked like a graveyard. He was still wearing the same suit, now rumpled and stained. He hadn't washed his hands. He felt like if he washed them, he would be washing away the last contact he had with Bumpy. He poured another glass of scotch. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the replay loop in his head. Click, turn, dead. He kept seeing Bumpy's face, the look in his eyes. Was it fear? Was it pain? Or was it disappointment? I didn't know. Frank whispered to the empty room. I didn't know, old man. I was just being me. The phone rang. Frank stared at it. He let it ring 5 times. 6. Finally, he picked it up. Yeah, he croaked. Frank? It was Zach, one of his top lieutenants. His voice sounded tight, breathless. Frank, you need to see this. See what? I don't want to see nothing. I'm mourning, Zach. Leave me alone. You ain't gonna be able to mourn, Frank, Zach said. You got a problem, a big one. It's on the street. It's everywhere. What are you talking about? Frank snapped, a flicker of his old aggression returning. A handbill, Frank. There's a flyer. Frank's blood went cold. He remembered the flash. He remembered Smokey. What about it? Frank asked, gripping the phone tight. You need to come downstairs, Zach said. Red Top's crew. They're pasting them up on the telephone poles. They're handing them out at the subway stations. I'm coming, Frank said. He hung up. He grabbed a gun, a .45 automatic, and shoved it into his waistband. He didn't put on the chinchilla coat. He put on a black leather jacket. He walked out the door, his eyes hard. When he stepped out onto the street, the humidity hit him again, but this time it felt cold. He walked to the corner. A small crowd was gathered around a telephone pole. They were whispering, pointing. When they saw Frank coming, they scattered like pigeons. They didn't look him in the eye. They looked at him with something new. Disgust. Frank walked up to the pole. Stapled to the wood was a grainy, high-contrast sheet of newsprint. The ink was cheap and smudged, but the image was a nightmare. There was Frank in the foreground, his teeth shining, his face lit up with a joy that looked maniacal in the black ink. He looked like he was celebrating. He looked like he had just won the lottery. And right behind his shoulder, Bumpy. His face was twisted in the rictus of a heart attack, his hand clawing at his shirt, his eyes rolling back. The contrast was brutal. Life and death, vanity and agony, the usurper and the fallen king. But it was the text underneath that made Frank's knees buckle, written in bold, jagged block letters. The Judas smile. He didn't help. He posed. "Is this your new king?" Frank stared at the paper. He couldn't breathe. It looked real. That was the horror of it. It was real. He had smiled. He had posed. But the context was gone. The split-second timing was erased. To anyone looking at this, it looked like Frank Lucas was laughing while Bumpy Johnson died. It looked like he had been waiting for this moment. It looked like he was happy the old man was gone. "No," Frank whispered. He reached out and ripped the paper off the pole, tearing it to shreds. "No, that's a lie." He looked down the street. Another flyer on the next pole, another on the wall of the bodega. They were everywhere. A car slowed down as it passed him. It was a car full of young men from the projects. They rolled down the window. "Traitor!" one of them screamed. "You let him die!" They sped off before Frank could even reach for his gun. Frank stood on the corner, holding the torn scraps of the flyer. He realized then that he wasn't fighting for the crown anymore. He wasn't fighting for territory or money. He was fighting for his life. Red Top, the rival who had always envied Bumpy's power but lacked his courage, had made his move. He hadn't used a bullet. He hadn't used a bomb. He had used a moment of vanity and turned it into a weapon of mass destruction. Frank looked at his reflection in a shop window. He didn't see the flashy gangster anymore. He saw a man standing in quicksand. "Zach," Frank said, seeing his lieutenant pull up in a car. "Get in." "Where are we going, Frank?" Zach asked, looking nervous. He had seen the flyers, too. Even he looked at Frank with a sliver of doubt. Frank saw the look. It cut him deeper than any knife. "We're going to find the photographer," Frank said, his voice dropping to a register that was pure ice. "We're going to find Smokey, and he's going to tell the truth, or I'm going to make sure he never takes another picture as long as he lives." Frank got into the car. He slammed the door. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The city was waking up to a scandal. Harlem was enraged. The king was dead, and the prince was holding the knife, or at least, the picture made it look like he was. Frank Lucas had wanted fame. He had wanted everyone to know his name. Now, everyone did, and they hated him for it. The flash had lasted 1/60th of a second, but the shadow it cast was going to last forever. The flyers were like autumn leaves in July, scattered across every stoop, every windshield, and every telephone pole from 110th Street to the river. But these leaves didn't crunch underfoot. They accused. They screamed. The grainy black ink had soaked into the paper, turning Frank Lucas's smile into a grotesque, skull-like grin, and Bumpy Johnson's agony into a backdrop for a traitor's vanity. Frank walked down 116th Street. He wasn't wearing the chinchilla coat. He was wearing a plain black shirt and slacks, but he felt naked. Every pair of eyes that landed on him felt like a lit cigarette pressed against his skin. He saw the whispers. He saw the way the old men at the chess tables turned their backs when he passed. He saw the way the mothers pulled their children closer. They thought he was Judas. They thought he had sold out the king for a photo op. "Go home, traitor," a voice hissed from a doorway. Frank stopped. He turned slowly, his hand hovering near the waistband where his .45 rested. A young man stood there, barely 20, eyes burning with righteous anger. A week ago, this kid would have begged to shine Frank's shoes. Today, he looked ready to die just to spit on him. "You don't know what you're talking about," Frank said, his voice raspy from whiskey and lack of sleep. "I see the picture," the kid spat back, pointing to a flyer stapled to the brick wall. "Picture don't lie. Bumpy dying, and you styling. You ain't no king. You're a clown." Frank flinched. The word hit harder than a bullet. Clown. That was the one thing a gangster could not be. You could be a killer, a thief, a monster. But you could not be a joke. Frank walked away. He didn't pull the gun. Shooting a civilian would only prove them right. He needed to find the source. He needed to cut the head off the snake that was poisoning the water. He found Zach waiting in the back of the Blue Note, a jazz club that was empty in the daylight. Zach looked tired. He had been fielding calls all morning, captains threatening to defect, runners refusing to pick up packages. The empire Bumpy had built was fracturing, hairline cracks turning into canyons. "It's Red Top," Zach said, sliding a glass of bourbon across the table. "He's the one printing them. He's got his guys running the press at that laundromat 24/7. He's churning them out by the thousands." "Red Top," Frank muttered, staring into the amber liquid. "That jealous, no-talent hack. He spent 20 years shining Bumpy's shoes, and now he thinks he can wear them." "He's calling a meeting tonight," Zach continued. "At the Cotton Club. He's inviting the 5 families. He's inviting the local crews. He's going to make a play for the crown, Frank. He's going to use that picture as his proof that you aren't fit to lead." Frank slammed the glass down. It didn't break, but the sound echoed in the empty club. "He wants a show?" Frank growled. "I'll give him a show, but first, I need the witness." "Smokey?" Zach asked. "The photographer?" "Find him," Frank said. "Turn this city upside down. I don't care if he's in a rat hole in the Bronx or a penthouse in Midtown. You bring him to me alive." "And if he won't come?" Frank looked up. His eyes were dark, devoid of the sparkle that usually defined him. The Superfly persona was gone. In its place was something cold, hard, and terrifyingly focused. "Then you break his legs and carry him," Frank said. "But he speaks tonight, or nobody speaks again." The hunt for Smokey was not a quiet affair. Frank Lucas didn't have the patience for subtlety anymore. He unleashed his crew like a pack of bloodhounds. They kicked down doors in dark rooms. They shook down newspaper editors. They terrified the girlfriends of freelance photographers. Harlem was a small place when you had money and muscle, and Smokey was a man who left a trail. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a terrified kid with a camera who had stumbled into a war. It was 4 p.m. when Zach called Frank from a payphone. "We got him," Zach said, breathing hard. He was hiding in the projection booth of the Apollo Theater, trying to sleep behind the screen. "Bring him to the warehouse on 125th, Frank ordered. "And Zach, don't bruise his face. He needs to look presentable for his funeral." Frank hung up. He checked his watch. The meeting at the Cotton Club was at 8 p.m., 4 hours to save his life, 4 hours to rewrite history. He drove to the warehouse alone. He needed the drive to think. He needed to channel Bumpy. What would the old man do? Bumpy wouldn't scream. Bumpy wouldn't panic. Bumpy would play chess. When Frank walked into the warehouse, Smokey was tied to a chair in the center of the dusty floor. He was weeping, his camera bag sitting sadly at his feet. He looked like a man who knew he was already dead. Frank walked up to him. He didn't yell. He pulled up a crate and sat down, knee to knee with the photographer. "Look at me," Frank said softly. Smokey shook his head, squeezing his eyes shut. "Please, Mr. Lucas, I didn't mean it. It was just a reflex. The shutter. It just went off." "Open your eyes," Frank commanded. Smokey opened them. They were wide with terror. "I'm not going to kill you," Frank said. "Not yet." He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the crumpled flyers. He smoothed it out on his knee. "You took this," Frank said, pointing to the image. "You were there. You saw what happened before the flash. You saw what happened after." "I saw," Smokey whispered. "You tried to help him. You were crying." "But that's not what this picture says," Frank said, his voice tightening. "This picture says I laughed. This picture says I wanted him dead. And because of this picture, my family is falling apart. My city hates me." "I know," Smokey sobbed. "Red Top. He paid me. He gave me $500 for the negative. He said it was for a memorial. I didn't know he was going to crop it. I didn't know he was going to put those words on it." $500, Frank repeated, shaking his head. "You sold the king's legacy for $500. Frank stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "You're going to fix it," Frank said. "How?" Smokey asked. "It's printed. It's everywhere." "We're going to the Cotton Club tonight," Frank said. "Red Top is having a party. He's celebrating his new kingdom. You're going to be the guest of honor." "He'll kill me," Smokey said, trembling. "He might," Frank shrugged. "But if you don't come with me, I will definitely kill you. And I'll take my time. I'll make it last a week." Frank turned back to the photographer. His face was stone. "You have a choice, Smokey. You can die as the rat who lied about Bumpy Johnson, or you can live as the man who told the truth. Which one is it going to be?" Smokey looked at the gun in Frank's waistband. He looked at the desperation in Frank's eyes. He realized that Frank wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for redemption. "I'll tell them," Smokey whispered. "I'll tell them everything." "Good," Frank said. He cut the ropes binding Smokey's hands. "Grab your camera." "My camera?" Smokey asked, rubbing his wrists. "Yeah," Frank said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Not the flashy smile from the photo, but a grim, dangerous curve. "We're going to need a new picture, a picture of what happens to liars." The Cotton Club was a cathedral of jazz and vice. It was where the elite of the underworld came to divide the spoils. Tonight, the mood was electric. The captains of the Harlem crews were there. Representatives from the Italian families were sitting in the back booths, sipping scotch, watching to see if the black leadership would crumble or consolidate. Red Top stood on the stage. He was a squat, heavy-set man with a loud voice and a suit that cost too much but still looked cheap. He held a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. Behind him, blown up to the size of a movie poster, was the picture. Frank's smile. Bumpy's death. Looming over the room like a curse. "Look at it!" Red Top shouted, gesturing to the poster. "Look at the disrespect! Bumpy Johnson built this city with blood and sweat, and this boy, this Superfly, he treats it like a joke. He grins while the king falls." The crowd murmured. Heads nodded. The evidence was undeniable. It was right there in black and white. "We need a leader who respects the tradition," Red Top bellowed, sensing the crowd was with him. "We need a man who was there when the bricks were laid, not a peacock who just wants to show his feathers. I say we strip Frank Lucas of everything. I say we run him out of Harlem." "Yeah," a few men shouted. "Run him out." Red Top beamed. He was winning. He had turned the tragedy into a coronation. The doors at the back of the club swung open. It wasn't a violent entrance. It wasn't a kick. It was a slow, deliberate push. Frank Lucas walked in. He was alone, or so it seemed. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps heavy on the plush carpet. He looked straight at the stage. He didn't look at the Italians. He didn't look at his defecting captains. He looked at Red Top. The room went silent. The music stopped. "You got a lot to say for a man standing in a dead man's shadow," Frank said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the rafters. Red Top froze. He hadn't expected Frank to show. He thought Frank was hiding, running, or dead. "You got some nerve coming here, Judas," Red Top sneered, trying to maintain control. "Read the room, Frank. You ain't wanted here. The picture speaks for itself." "Pictures don't speak," Frank said, continuing his walk to the stage. "Men speak, and liars speak the loudest." Frank stopped at the edge of the stage. He looked up at Red Top. "You cropped the photo, Red. You cut out the truth." "Truth?" Red Top laughed nervously. "The truth is on the wall. You were smiling." "I was smiling at a camera," Frank said. "I wasn't smiling at death, and you know it, because you bought the negative from the man who took it." Frank whistled. A sharp, piercing sound. From the shadows of the entrance, Zach stepped out. He was dragging Smokey by the arm. Smokey looked terrified, clutching his camera like a shield. "Bring him up," Frank commanded. Zach marched Smokey onto the stage. The crowd watched, mesmerized. This was theater. This was court. "Tell them," Frank said to Smokey. "Tell them what you told me." Smokey looked at the crowd. He looked at Red Top, whose face was turning a shade of purple. He looked at the blown-up poster behind him. I took the picture," Smokey stammered into the microphone Frank handed him. "I asked for a photo." Frank stood up. He turned around to pose. "Bumpy, Mr. Johnson." He was fine when Frank stood up. The room was dead silent. Even the ice melting in the glasses seemed loud. "Frank didn't know," Smokey continued, his voice gaining a little strength. "He didn't see him. Bumpy made no sound. When the flash went off, that's when Frank turned around. He tried to save him. He screamed for a doctor. He was crying." Smokey pointed a shaking finger at Red Top. "He paid me," Smokey said. "Red Top paid me $500. He told me to say Frank laughed. He told me to say Frank let him die." A murmur rippled through the room. The Italians in the back sat up straighter. The captains looked at each other. The narrative was shifting. The monster was becoming a victim, and Red Top was becoming a snake. Red Top panicked. He lunged for Smokey. "Liar! He paid you to say that. You rat!" Frank moved. He didn't move like a showman. He moved like a cobra. He vaulted onto the stage. He intercepted Red Top, grabbing his wrist before he could strike the photographer. "You don't touch him," Frank snarled. "He's the only honest man on this stage." Frank twisted Red Top's arm. There was a snap. Red Top screamed, dropping to his knees. Frank grabbed the microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces. Bumpy Johnson was my father, Frank said. His voice broke, raw and real. Not by blood, but by everything that matters. I loved that man. And yeah, I was a fool. I was vain. I wanted my picture taken. And because of that, I missed his last breath. I have to live with that. Every day I have to look in the mirror and know that I was smiling while he was dying. Frank looked at the poster. He looked at his own smiling face. Tears welled up in his eyes, unbidden. "That's my punishment," Frank whispered. "But this?" He pointed at Red Top. "Using his death? Using my mistake to grab power? That's not business. That's sacrilege." Frank released Red Top's arm. He took a step back. "I'm not going to kill you, Red," Frank said. "Bumpy didn't like killing inside the club. It's bad for business." Red Top scrambled backward, clutching his broken arm. You can't." "But I am going to teach you a lesson about pictures," Frank said. He turned to Smokey. "Take the picture," Frank said. "What?" Smokey asked. "Take the picture of the new king," Frank said. He pointed to Red Top, cowering on the floor, sweating, crying, broken. "Take the picture of what happens when you lie about Bumpy Johnson." Smokey raised the camera. Click. P.O.P. The flashbulb exploded again. It captured Red Top in his shame. It captured Frank standing over him, not smiling, but looking grim, heavy, and dangerous. Frank turned to the crowd. "The show is over," he said. "Go home. Funeral is tomorrow. And if I see one more of these flyers on the street, the man holding it goes into the ground with them." He walked off the stage. He didn't look back. The crowd parted for him, not out of admiration for his coat, but out of fear of his resolve. He had walked into the lion's den with nothing but the truth, and he had walked out with the crown. The funeral of Bumpy Johnson was the largest Harlem had ever seen. It rained, of course. It always rains when a legend is buried. Thousands of people lined the streets. The procession stretched for 20 blocks. Flowers piled up like snowdrifts outside St. Martin's Episcopal Church. Inside, the air was thick with incense and sorrow. The casket was bronze, solid and heavy, just like the man inside. Frank Lucas stood in the back. He didn't sit in the front row. He didn't stand with the family. He felt he didn't deserve it. The guilt of that smile still gnawed at him, a parasite eating his heart. He watched Mamie Johnson. She was dressed in black veils, sitting straight-backed and proud. She was the queen. Even in grief, she held the room together. When the service ended, the mourners filed past the casket. Frank waited until the end. He walked up to the open coffin. Bumpy looked peaceful. The mortician had done a good job. The pain was gone from his face. He looked like he was just resting between moves in a chess game. "I'm sorry, old man," Frank whispered, placing a hand on the edge of the casket. "I'm listening now. I'm watching. No more distractions." He felt a hand on his arm. He turned. It was Mamie. She looked at him through her veil. Her eyes were red, but they were clear. "He loved you, Frank," she said softly. "I failed him, Mamie," Frank choked out. "The picture." "I saw the picture," Mamie interrupted. "And I saw the new one, the one from the club." She squeezed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Ellsworth hated vanity," she said. "He always said it would be your downfall, but he also said you had a heart. A heart that was too big for this business. She looked at the casket. Don't let the picture define you, Frank. Let the work define you. He didn't leave the city to a photograph. He left it to a man. Are you that man? Frank looked at Bumpy. He looked at Mamie. He took a deep breath, inhaling the incense and the rain. I am, Frank said. I am. Then fix your tie, Mamie said, straightening his collar, and go to work. That night, Wells' restaurant was quiet. The jazz band was playing a slow, mournful tune. The booth in the back was empty. Nobody dared to sit there. Frank walked in. He wasn't wearing the chinchilla coat. He was wearing a simple trench coat, wet from the rain. He walked to the booth. He sat down. Not in Bumpy's seat. That seat would stay empty tonight, but in his own seat across from it. Betty, the waitress, came over. She looked at him with sad eyes. Coffee, Frank? She asked. Black, Frank said. And Betty, burn the bill. She nodded and walked away. Frank reached into his pocket. He pulled out the original flyer, the one he had torn off the telephone pole, the one with the Judas smile. He stared at it for a long time. He looked at his own face, freezing in that moment of ignorance. He hated that boy in the picture. That boy was loud. That boy was reckless. That boy thought he would live forever. That boy died when Bumpy died. Frank took a lighter from his pocket, a simple silver Zippo. He flicked it open. The flame danced in the drafty room. He held the flame to the corner of the flyer. The paper curled. The fire ate the smile first. It turned the white teeth into black ash. It consumed the flashy suit, the diamonds, the arrogance. Finally, it consumed Bumpy's pain, releasing him from the page. Frank watched it burn until it was nothing but dust in the ashtray. He looked up. The door opened. A young kid walked in. He had a camera around his neck. He saw Frank sitting there. He hesitated. He saw the empty seat opposite him. He saw the darkness in Frank's eyes. The kid took a step forward, lifting his camera. Mr. Lucas, can I... Frank didn't shout. He didn't stand up. He didn't smile. He just looked at the kid. His eyes were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of ego. They were the eyes of a man who understood the weight of the crown. No more pictures, Frank said softly. The kid lowered the camera. He nodded, terrified by the quiet power radiating from the booth. He backed away and left the restaurant. Frank turned back to his coffee. He took a sip. It was hot, bitter, and black. He looked at the empty seat across from him. He raised his cup in a silent toast. Your move, Bumpy, he whispered. Outside, the rain washed the streets of Harlem clean, washing away the flyers, washing away the blood, leaving the city ready for the reign of the American gangster. The flashbulb had faded, but the darkness was here to stay.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.